The boy who never fit into the room was too small, the noise too loud, and the books too few. Sundar sat in the back row of the crowded classroom in Chennai, his thin body barely taking up any space on the wooden bench. Sweat gathered on his forehead. But he didn't wipe it. He was listening, really listening, while most of the other boys passed notes or daydreamed about cricket matches. The teacher's voice was distant, like it was coming through water. But to Sundar, every word mattered. He wasn't trying to get ahead. He was trying to stay in the game outside the classroom. Life was harder. Sundar's home had one ceiling fan, and it clicked loudly every night, like a ticking clock that reminded him of time he didn't have. His father, a quiet man who worked as an electrical engineer, came home late and tired. He never spoke much, but when he did, Sundar listened. "Be kind," his father once told him, "even when the world is not." Those words stuck. Even though the world wasn't kind to Sundar at all, Sundar wasn't like the other boys. He didn't fight for the front seat in the school bus, didn't laugh at cruel jokes, and didn't speak unless someone spoke to him first. Some called him slow. Some said he was too soft. He didn't care much. He had a secret, something he didn't even understand yet. He could remember numbers. Not just remember them, but see them, hold them in his mind like objects. When his teacher once asked him to recall a 10-digit phone number spoken only once, Sundar repeated it without blinking. The whole class laughed. They thought he had memorized it beforehand. No one believed him, but he hadn't. He just remembered things. Most people forgot the moment they heard them dot one day. The school held a debate. Sundar's name appeared on the list by accident. The teacher had meant to write Sundaram, a loud, confident boy who always wore the cleanest uniform. Sundar tried to say it wasn't him, but the teacher waved him off. "Everyone gets a turn," she said. Sundar's heart pounded so loud he could hear it in his ears. He had never spoken in front of a crowd before, never stood on that wooden stage where lights burned hot and faces stared like eyes in the dark. When his name was called, he walked up slowly, holding his speech with trembling fingers. He had written it the night before, knowing deep down they wouldn't let him off the hook. It was about respect, not respect you demand, but respect you earn. He spoke quietly at first. A few students chuckled. Someone in the back whistled. But he didn't stop. The more he spoke, the more still the room became, not because he was loud or clever or funny, but because he was honest. He spoke about how being soft is not the same as being weak, how silence is not always fear, and how sometimes the quietest people carry the strongest voices if you only let them speak. When he stepped off the stage, no one clapped. It wasn't out of cruelty, it was confusion. They didn't expect that from him, and that was the moment Sundar realized something. Being underestimated was his greatest strength. People didn't see him coming, and that gave him time to rise without pressure. He liked that the years passed. Sundar's love for knowledge grew like roots under stone, slow but unbreakable. He studied in dim light, worked on borrowed textbooks, and walked long distances to save money. He didn't mind. Struggle didn't scare him. What scared him was the idea of being average, of living a life where no one ever looked past the surface. He wanted to build things, change things, make systems better. He didn't know it yet, but his journey would one day take him into rooms filled with billionaires and politicians. But first, he had to face a world that didn't believe he belonged there. In college, Sundar was the quiet one again. His English was broken, his accent thick. Some professors dismissed him. One even told him he would never succeed in anything beyond paperwork. Sundar said nothing. But that night, he stayed up till dawn, studying legal systems from around the world. Not because he wanted revenge, but because he knew one day he would need to speak for himself, and he didn't want to stumble when that day came. That day came sooner than he thought. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Sundar entered a courtroom for the first time. Not as a lawyer, not yet. He was just a student attending a public hearing as part of his internship. He took notes, watched the lawyers argue, and listened to the judge. It was supposed to be a learning experience, But something happened that day that would change everything. A middle-aged man stood in front of the court, accused of stealing a few bags of rice from a government warehouse. He looked tired, hungry, and beaten down. His lawyer had not shown. The judge, impatient and cold, was ready to pass sentence. Sundar raised his hand. The room fell silent. The judge raised an eyebrow. Yes? Your Honor, Sundar said, his voice shaking. May I speak on behalf of the accused? The judge laughed. The courtroom echoed with it. And who are you? The judge asked, leaning forward, amused. His son? His lawyer? Or just another boy who thinks he knows the law? Sundar didn't flinch. I am no one important, he said. Just someone who believes in fairness. The judge sighed, ready to dismiss him. But Sundar continued. He spoke calmly, laying out what he had learned from the case file. He pointed out that the accused was a former employee of the warehouse, had been fired unfairly, and had a daughter who had not eaten in 2 days. He quoted law sections with perfect accuracy. His words were simple but exact. And as he spoke, the laughter in the courtroom died down. Even the judge leaned back, frowning, but not with anger. With thought that the judge didn't make a decision that day. He called for further investigation, and as the crowd left the courtroom, several people turned to look at Sundar, not with mockery, but with curiosity. That night, Sundar sat alone on a bench outside the court building. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet. He wasn't sure what had happened. He hadn't planned it. He had just spoken, from the heart, with knowledge he had worked hard to earn. And somehow, that had made a difference. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that someone in the back of that courtroom had been watching. A man in a gray suit. He had come to see another case, but had stayed to watch Sundar. And now he was making a phone call to someone powerful, someone who could change Sundar's life forever. Sundar went home that night thinking the moment was over. But it was only the beginning. A shadow in the crowd center didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear or excitement, but because something inside him had shifted. Something small, like a pebble dropped into still water. He kept hearing the judge's laughter in his head, not the sound of mockery, but the moment it stopped. The moment the courtroom went quiet. The moment people, for once, actually listened. He didn't know what to do with that. All his life he had been invisible. Now, for the first time, he had been seen. The next morning was gray and humid. Sundar walked to the legal aid office where he interned. It was a small building, walls stained with time, chairs that creaked when you sat on them. Most of the cases they handled were about stolen vegetables, unfair wages, or broken promises. People who couldn't afford lawyers came here. And most days, no one really won. Sundar didn't mind. He came to learn, and more importantly, to help. He didn't know that today would be different. As he entered, an older man with sharp eyes and a thin mustache stood near the doorway. He looked out of place in his tailored gray suit. His shoes were clean, his voice low and calm. He said he was looking for Sundar. Sundar hesitated, unsure if he was in trouble. The man introduced himself simply. My name is Mr. Sharma. I work with the High Court. Sundar blinked. Is there a problem, sir? Not at all, the man replied. In fact, there may be an opportunity. They sat down at the back of the office, away from the noise. Mr. Sharma leaned forward, resting, his hands on his knees. I saw you speak yesterday. Most people your age don't risk stepping forward, especially in court. And fewer still manage to silence a judge, not with anger, but with knowledge. Sundar didn't know what to say. Compliments weren't something he was used to about Mr. Sharma. Continued, we run a fellowship, very few people get in. It's for those who see law not just as rules, but as a tool to protect the powerless. We need someone who can listen, someone who can lead without shouting. I think that might be you. Sundar was stunned. This wasn't just a scholarship. This was access to judges, lawmakers, and real cases that shaped lives. He would have to move to Delhi, leave his home, his routine, his comfort. And yet, something deep inside told him that staying where he was would mean shrinking into a life too small for his spirit. He asked for a day to think. Mr. Sharma smiled. Take two, he said that night. Sundar sat with his parents. His mother held his hand as he explained the offer. His father didn't speak for a long time. Then he stood, walked to a shelf, and pulled out a box. Inside was a file wrapped in cloth. It held old certificates, worn with age. One of them had his father's name on it. I once had a chance too, his father said quietly. But I chose safety. Not regret, but safety. If this is your path, walk it, even if it scares you. That was all Sundar needed to hear within. A week, he packed his things, a single bag, a worn notebook, and a heart filled with nervous courage. He took the train to Delhi. The city was a different world, louder, faster, harder. No one looked at you twice. Here, you either kept up or you got lost. The fellowship began with silence. No introductions, no hand-holding. Sundar was placed in a group of 5. The others were older, sharper, more polished. One of them, a young woman named Tara, wore confidence like armor. She raised her hand, often, challenged professors, and never hesitated to interrupt. Sundar admired her, and feared her a little too. She seemed to come from a world he'd only seen in newspapers, boarding schools, English fluency, family connections. During one heated discussion about legal ethics, Tara laughed when Sundar mispronounced a word. It wasn't cruel, just casual, but it burned. Sundar felt the familiar sting of being underestimated. Again, always again. He stayed quiet that day. But the next day, when the class was given a case to review, a complex one involving land rights and corporate fraud, Sundar stayed up all night decoding it. He built a timeline, read 3 old case references, and filled his notebook with questions. When it was his turn to present, he spoke slowly, carefully, but what he said made the entire class turn to look. He pointed out a technical flaw in the company's legal documents that no one else had seen. Even the professor sat forward, tapping his pen on the desk, listening more closely now. When Sundar finished, there was no applause. There was just silence, the kind that means respect. Class. Tara walked up to him. Where did you learn all that? She asked, genuinely curious. Sundar looked at her, smiled slightly, and said, from not being heard for most of my life. It teaches you to listen better. From that day, something changed between them. They began working together. Not as friends, not yet, but as people who respected each other. She taught him how to speak with more ease, more clarity. He taught her how to see things others missed. Together, they grew stronger. Weeks turned into months. Sundar started handling real cases under supervision. He visited prisons, rural courts, even villages where law was still a rumor. He listened to women who had been cheated out of land, laborers who had never been paid, and families who had lost. Everything because no one told them their rights. Each story cut into him. And every time, he promised himself, I will not let them be forgotten. But not everyone was happy with his rise. One day, Sundar received a sealed letter at the office. It was from the central government, an invitation to speak at a public forum on justice reform. Someone had noticed his work. Someone had recommended him. His professor warned him, this is not a game. The people in that room are powerful. One mistake, and they will crush you. Sundar nodded. He knew. But he also knew he couldn't back down. He prepared for days, writing and rewriting his speech. It wasn't just about laws. It was about people. About how justice wasn't a building or a robe. It was a promise. And promises meant nothing if only a few ever heard them. When the day came, the hall was packed. Judges, ministers, media, all seated in rows like rows of statues. Sundar stood at the podium, his hands cold. He began to speak. At first, a few looked bored. Some checked their phones. But as Sundar spoke, slowly, firmly, their heads lifted. He told the story of a woman who walked 8 kilometers to file a complaint, only to be turned away because she couldn't sign her name. He spoke about the silence in village courts and the noise in city ones, about how kindness had no legal definition. But was the first thing every lawyer should learn. When he finished, the room stayed quiet. And then the Hawes came. Not polite, but real. That night, as he walked out of the building, Tara caught up with him. That was brave, she said. It wasn't bravery, Sundar replied. Just truth. But what he didn't know was that somewhere in that same hall, a man with a plan had been watching. Not just watching, calculating. He saw Sundar not as a student or a speaker, but as a threat. Someone who couldn't be bought, and that made him dangerous. This man made a call. And 3 days later, Sundar received a court notice. He was being accused of violating legal ethics and impersonating a lawyer. Without a license. It made no sense. But the papers were real. The charges were serious. And the judge assigned to the case, the same one who had once laughed at him in court. This time, the laughter would return. Or so they thought. Asterisk, the court of whisper sundar stood in the hallway of the courthouse, holding the envelope like it might burst into flames. The paper inside was crisp, heavy with ink and accusation. It was official. He had been summoned to answer for charges that didn't make sense. He wasn't a lawyer yet, they said. He had spoken in a legal capacity. He had misled the court. It was all written so cleanly, so formally, that it almost felt true. But Sundar knew the truth. He had never claimed to be more than he was. He had only tried to help. And now someone was trying to destroy him for it. The old courtroom smelled like dust and iron. The walls were tall and heavy, like they had seen too much and forgotten nothing. Sundar had walked into this building many times before, as an intern, a learner, a listener. But today, he was different. Today, he was the accused. He stepped inside quietly. The judge hadn't arrived yet. The air was filled with whispers. Some people recognized him. Some pointed. Some smirked. Tara sat in the back, her face unreadable, her eyes locked on him. She had tried to warn him not to go alone, but Sundar had insisted. He believed in his cause. He still did. But belief doesn't always protect you from power. When the judge finally entered, Sundar felt something strange. Not fear exactly, but a sharp awareness, like walking barefoot on broken glass. The judge looked older now, but his eyes were still hard. And yes, he was the same man who had once laughed at Sundar. But today there was no laughter in his face. There was only a tired amusement, like someone ready to teach a lesson. Mr. Pichai, the judge said, adjusting his glasses, you stand accused of practicing law without credentials. How do you plead? Sundar stepped forward. His voice was low but steady. Not guilty, Your Honor. I never claimed to be a lawyer. I only spoke to prevent a judgment made without defense. The judge nodded like he had expected this. And you believe that justifies interfering in a legal process? I believe justice should not be delayed because someone is poor. Sundar replied, or unheard. A small laugh escaped the judge's mouth. Noble words, but words are not law. Sundar said nothing. His silence wasn't weakness. It was control. The prosecutor, a tall man with sharp teeth in his smile, stepped up. He painted Sundar as reckless, a boy playing hero. He quoted laws through dates in sections like stones. Sundar listened carefully, not to the words, but to the gaps between them. He noticed something strange. The prosecutor mentioned a case, file number that didn't match the original one. It was a small mistake, one most would miss. But Sundar didn't miss things. When it was his turn to speak, Sundar asked for permission to approach the bench. The judge allowed it more out of curiosity than courtesy. Sundar opened his notebook and placed it on the table. Inside were copies of the case file, the real one. Your Honor, he said, this is the original record from the public hearing. The file number cited by the prosecution belongs to a different case. Unrelated, but useful if someone wanted to create confusion. The judge frowned, taking the papers. He compared them. Then he looked at the prosecutor, who suddenly coughed and looked away. This doesn't excuse your behavior, the judge said to Sundar. No, Sundar agreed. But it questions the fairness of the accusations. The judge didn't answer. A break was called. In the hallway, Tara approached him. That was clever, she said. Not clever, Sundar replied. Just careful. They sat on a bench, watching the clouds gather through the high windows. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. You know, someone powerful is trying to silence you, right? I know, he said quietly. Asterisk, why? Sundar shrugged. Because I don't belong to anyone. And that's dangerous, she didn't argue. Instead, she gave him a folder. Read this. It's from a case I'm working on. The same name appears in your file, Minister Raghav Mehta. Sundar froze. He knew that name. Raghav Mehta was a political giant, a man known for land deals and silence. His signature had appeared on the document Sundar had once questioned in a rural property dispute quietly, without spotlight. Now it made sense. Sundar had poked a sleeping lion, and the lion had chosen to wake. When court resumed, the judge looked more serious. He asked Sundar to explain, in full, what had happened that day in the courtroom. Sundar spoke clearly. He explained how the accused had no lawyer, how the judge was about to rule without hearing his side, how Sundar had merely asked to speak, not to win. Just to be fair, when he finished, the judge looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the prosecutor. Do you have anything further to add? The prosecutor hesitated. No, Your Honor. Then I will issue my ruling tomorrow. Asterisk, the courtroom emptied slowly. Sundar remained seated, staring at the ground. That night, he couldn't sleep again, but not because of fear this time. Because he realized something painful truth was not always enough. He had played by the rules, spoken with respect, used facts, but the system didn't always reward honesty. Sometimes it punished it. Not with violence, but with silence. They could drain you without touching you, wear you down until you gave up and went home. But Sundar wasn't going home. The next morning, the courtroom was packed again. Word had spread. A boy with no title had stood his ground against the system. That preferred order over justice. The judge read the verdict slowly. Asterisk. Mr. Pichai acted outside of official legal capacity. However, there is no evidence of personal gain or misrepresentation. Rather, the evidence shows intent to prevent a miscarriage of justice. Therefore, the charges are dismissed. But let this be a reminder: law is not a theater. Even the right actions must follow the right path. The courtroom buzzed. Sundar's hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from restraint. He wanted to cry, to breathe. He turned around and, for the first time in weeks, saw hope in the eyes of those who watched. But the judge wasn't finished. Mr. Pichai, he said, I dismiss the charges. But there's something more. Your conduct may not be legal yet, but it is rare, and it is needed. I have spoken with the Bar Council. If you agree, and if you pass their exam, you will be fast-tracked into legal service under special provisions. But it will be hard, and you will be watched. Sundar nodded, slowly. I accept. He walked out of the courtroom into the open air. The sun was sharp on his face. Tara followed behind him, smiling. You just made history, she said. I don't want history, he replied. I want change. What he didn't know was that someone else had been in that courtroom again. Not a minister, not a judge. Someone younger, a student. One who had lost faith in law, who had almost dropped out. That student had watched Sundar stand tall, and in that moment, the future of another life quietly shifted. But for Sundar, the road was not getting easier. In fact, it was about to get darker. Because 2 days later, Tara went missing. Asterisk, the silence between heartbeats morning after Tara disappeared. Delhi felt colder. The air wasn't colder, just the feeling in it. Sundar had barely slept. He kept thinking about her last words to him. You just made history. He remembered her half-smile, the way she always walked a little faster than him. Like she knew where life was going and dared it to catch her. Now her phone was switched off. Her apartment door was locked. No one had seen her in 12 hours. And The strange thing was, no one was acting like it mattered. He went to the director of the fellowship. They told him not to worry. Maybe she had gone away for a few days. Maybe she needed a break. Sundar didn't believe that. Tara didn't run from problems. She ran toward them. She had been working on something big, something connected to Minister Raghav Mehta. Sundar knew this because the last file she handed him had his name in it, again and again. But now that file was gone. And so, was she Sundar searched everywhere? He could. He checked hospitals, hostels, and the train station. He even stood in front of the police station, holding her picture, but the officers shrugged. She's an adult, one of them said. Maybe she left on her own. But Sundar knew that kind of silence. He had seen it before silence used. Not because there were no answers, but because people were too afraid to say them. He returned to her apartment. He sat on the floor outside her door, closed his eyes, and tried to think. What would she have done? Where would she have gone? And then he remembered something she once told him. If anything ever happens to me, don't trust noise. Trust patterns. It had sounded like a joke when she said it. Now it felt like a clue. He opened his notebook and went through every case they had reviewed together. There were 5 cases that had gone cold without reason. In each one, a witness had backed out. The same legal firm had handled the government's side. And in all 5 cases, one name appeared on the financial transfer logs. RM Associates. Sundar dug deeper. He found that RM didn't exist officially. No registration, no office, no website. Just initials and bank trails. But in one of Tara's emails, there was a list of shell companies. One of them had the same initials. She had marked it with a red circle. He didn't know what to do with that information yet. But he knew who would got Mr. Sharma. The man who had first invited him to Delhi was retired now. He lived in a small house on the edge of the city, surrounded by books and silence. Sundar found him there, sipping tea, watching the news without sound. I need help, Sundar said. Sharma looked up slowly. What kind of help? The kind you can't ask for out loud. Sundar laid out everything: Tara's disappearance, the missing file, the company links. Sharma listened without interrupting. When Sundar finished, he nodded once and stood. Come, he said. There's something I need to show you. They went into a back room filled with boxes and folders. Sharma pulled out an old file from his years in the ministry. It was thick, yellowed, heavy with dust. Raghav Mehta was once under investigation. He said, years ago, bribery, land theft, intimidation. But the case vanished, witnesses changed their stories, evidence disappeared, and then ... silence. He opened the file. Sundar saw names he recognized: judges, journalists, businessmen. All connected, all protected. Tara found something, Sundar said, and now she's gone. Then you must find what she found, Sharma said, and this time, make sure it doesn't vanish. They scanned through the old documents. Hidden between pages was a photographed Tara, standing next to a whistleblower Sundar had never met. Scribbled on the back was a name and a location: Shailendra, Sarashpur village. The next morning, Sundar boarded a bus to Sarashpur. The road was long and broken. The village was small, quiet, and filled with eyes that didn't trust strangers. He asked for Shailendra. Most people looked away. One old man finally pointed to a narrow path near the river. He found Shailendra living in a broken house, the roof patched with tin, the windows covered in cloth. The man was thin, with eyes that looked 10 years older than his face. I knew Tara, he said before Sundar could speak. And I warned her, some things are not meant to be touched. She touched them anyway, Sundar said. And now, she's gone. Shailendra looked out at the river. You remind me of her. Same fire, same foolish bravery. Sundar waited. After a long silence, Shailendra handed him a black envelope. She told me to give this to someone she trusted. I hoped that day wouldn't come. Inside were pages, copies of financial records, hidden transfers, signed orders. Everything pointed to a land deal involving the minister's office. Poor families had been forced out and their land handed over to a company under fake names. Tara had tracked the paper trail. She had found the proof. Can this bring her back? Sundar asked. A-A-L-E-L-E. Shook his head. No, but it might stop others from disappearing. Sundar returned to Delhi with the envelope. He couldn't go to the police. Not yet. He didn't know who to trust. Instead, he went to someone who owed him nothing, but respected the law more than power. The same judge who had once laughed at him. The judge met him in private chambers. Sundar placed the documents on the table. This is evidence, Sundar said, and this is a name we both know. The judge read the pages slowly. His face hardened. You understand what you're doing? The judge asked. I'm doing what she started. Sundar replied. The judge closed the folder. You'll need protection. This isn't a student project, it's war. Sundar nodded. Double quotes, and what happens if you lose? The judge asked. Ben. At least, Sundar said, they'll know we fought. But outside that chamber, someone else was watching. A man in a dark car, holding a phone, whispering a name. And later that night, as Sundar returned to his small room, he found the door open. The lights were off. His papers were gone. And on his desk, a single word had been written in dust. Stop. Asterisk. Quiet before the storm. When Sundar saw the word written in dust, stop, he didn't move for a long time. The room around him was still, but his mind raced like thunder behind his eyes. The word wasn't just a threat. It was a warning. No broken window, no noise, no forced entry. Whoever had come in wanted him to know something important. They could reach him anytime, anywhere, without anyone noticing. He stepped into the room carefully. Everything looked the same on the surface. His notebooks neatly stacked, his jacket hanging by the door, his teacup untouched on the table. But underneath, that calm, something had been taken. The black envelope was gone. The one Tara had trusted him with. The evidence that could bring down powerful men. Gone. He searched the room anyway. Like maybe it had just moved. Like maybe this was all a mistake. But deep down, he already knew the truth. The people who wanted him silent had been watching. And now, they had taken what mattered most. Sundar sat on the floor, his back against the cold wall. For the first time since Tara disappeared, he felt something close to helplessness. Not fear exactly, but a slow, sinking weight that pressed against his chest. He had come so far. He had taken every step carefully. He had believed that truth was enough. But now, truth was no longer in his hands. He closed his eyes and thought about his father. Be kind even when the world is not. It had sounded so simple then, like something you could live by without pain. But now, Sundar wondered, what does kindness look like when the world is trying to break you? He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he began again. Asterisk, he went to the library at dawn, searching for public records. He went back through his notes, his memory, his conversations with Tara. Piece by piece, he tried to rebuild what was lost. Some things came back, names, dates, patterns, but it was slower this time. Heavier. Then came a knock. Not at the door. At the library table. A young woman stood there, holding a small white envelope. Are you Sundar? She asked. He nodded. Asterisk. This is from someone who said you might need it. Before he could ask who, she turned and walked away. He opened the envelope. Inside was a USB drive and a note, written in Tara's handwriting. Don't try to erase everything. Keep this one safe. His heart stopped. She had made a copy. Sundar rushed to the old fellowship office, where the computers weren't connected to any central server. He plugged in the USB and waited. The screen flickered, then loaded a folder named Truth Insurance. Inside were scanned files, audio clips, and a short video. The files repeated everything from before land deals, bribes, secret accounts. The audio was of a man's voice, low, careful, giving instructions to shut down protests and move families without paperwork. The voice was unmistakable. It was rug of meta. But the video was the hardest to watch. It showed Tara sitting in a small room speaking directly to the camera. If you're seeing this, she said, then I've gone missing. And it means they're afraid. It means what we found is real. Don't be afraid for me. Do what we started. Tell everyone. Make them see. Sundar watched it twice. The second time, he didn't blink. Her eyes were steady, her voice soft but unshaken. She wasn't afraid to disappear. But she was afraid to be forgotten. He uploaded everything to 3 separate drives. One he kept with him, one he gave to Sharma, and the third he placed in an envelope and mailed anonymously to the judge. He didn't trust many people, but he trusted that judge's silence more than others' promises. He knew what had to come. Next, not just legal action, not just a case, but something bigger, a public trial, one where the truth could not be buried behind closed doors. He filed a petition the next morning. A public interest litigation, accusing Raghav Mehta and associated firms of illegal land grabbing, suppression of evidence, and political abuse of power. He submitted Tara's files as supporting documentation. And when the clerk looked up at him, surprised that a student was bringing a case against a government minister, Sundar only said one thing. This isn't about me. It's about everyone they thought wouldn't fight back. The case was accepted, and the fire began. First came the phone calls. Strange voices warning him to withdraw. Then came the media. At first, they ignored it. Then they mocked it. Student, activist overreaches, one headline said. But when the documents leaked online, people began to read. People began to listen. And then someone tried to break him. One morning, Sundar's father called. There had been a fire near their home in Chennai. No one was hurt, but the neighbors said someone had thrown a burning bottle at their gate. Sundar's hand shook. He had been careful. He hadn't mentioned his family. But they had found them anyway. He wanted to go back, to protect them. But his father's voice stopped him. Stay there, he said. If you come back now, they win. We're not afraid. You don't be either. So Sundar stayed. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the hearing. Reporters lined the hallway. The judge, the same one who had once mocked him, now sat with serious eyes. The minister had not shown up. His lawyer was there instead, confident, smiling, and full of words. Sundar stood to speak. He didn't speak like a lawyer. He spoke like someone who had walked too far to turn back. He showed the files. He played the audio. He told the stories of the people who had lost their homes, their voices, their hope. And he played Tara's video last. No one moved while it played. And when it ended, the judge did something rare. He looked directly at Sundar. You've brought fire into this court, he said. Now we will see who burns and who survives. The room was silent. But far away. In a dark office, Raghav Mehta leaned back in his chair. Listening to the news. His eyes narrowed. He picked up the phone. End it, he said. And somewhere in Delhi, a man with cold hands and no name began walking toward Sundar's door. Asterisk the weight of one voice at night before the final hearing. Sundar sat at his desk, staring at the walls of his room. They were bare now. No papers, no maps, no photos of Tara. Everything had been removed in case someone tried again to take it. It was quiet. Not peaceful, just the kind of quiet that comes before someone breaks. He hadn't slept in 2 nights. His body ached, but his mind wouldn't rest. He kept thinking about all the people who had been silenced. Not just Tara, but the families who had been pushed off their land. The children whose schools had been closed. The workers who had waited years for justice, only to be told their pain didn't matter. He thought of his father's words, still ringing in his head like a drum. Be kind even when the world is not. And then he thought of the man with cold hands, the one walking toward his door. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't call the police. He just locked the door and sat by the window, waiting. At 3:12 a.m., the door creaked, not like someone knocking, like someone trying to open it quietly. Sundar stood slowly. His hand shook, but not with fear, with focus. He had taken precautions. A second lock, a piece of string tied to the inner latch, so even if someone picked it, it would catch. And next to the door, a camera borrowed from a friend silently recording. The handle turned once, then stopped. Not a minute passed. Then two. Then footsteps retreated. He stayed awake until dawn. By the time the sun rose, the street outside was already buzzing with life. Students on bicycles, tea sellers calling out prices, stray dogs chasing shadows. Sundar walked past them like he was walking through water. Everything felt far away. Today was the last hearing. Today would decide if the truth had any place left in the system, or if it would be buried again, deeper than before. The courtroom was already full when he arrived. Reporters, students, older men in suits who had never once glanced at him before now leaned in to see his face. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't smile. He just walked to the bench and waited. When a judge entered, the room stood. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. Beside him were two senior justices, added. For this case, this wasn't just a trial now, it was a message. The minister's lawyer stood first. He spoke for nearly an hour. Said the documents were forged, the video edited, the voice not real. Said Sundar was hungry for attention, using lies to gain fame. Said Tara was unstable, unreliable, maybe even involved in some kind of blackmail. He said it all with calm, controlled words. A performance of polished denial. When he sat down, all eyes turned to Sundar. He rose, slowly, walked to the center, and paused. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked at the crowd, not at the powerful men, not at the judge, but at the people sitting in the back, the ones without suits, the ones who looked tired, curious, or quietly hopeful, the ones like him. Then he spoke. I was never meant to be here, he said softly. Not in this room, not in this position, not in front of all of you. The room fell quiet. I come from a place where voices don't travel far, where people don't fight the system because they know the system doesn't care. I didn't plan to become part of this. I just saw something wrong, and I spoke. He paused, and maybe that was my mistake. Speaking when I was supposed to stay quiet. He opened the folder in his hands and pulled out a printed frame from Tara's video. This is Tara. She's not a criminal. She's not unstable. She's the reason any of this exists. She found the truth, and they made her disappear. He turned to the judge. We've all heard the evidence. The money trails, the audio files, the video. It's all there. And still, we ask, is it enough? But maybe the real question is, what will ever be enough? How many voices? How many lives? How much silence? He took a deep breath. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to believe the law. Because if the law cannot protect truth, then what is it for? He stepped back. Asterisk silence followed. The judge leaned forward, fingers interlocked. We will now deliberate. He said. And the room emptied slowly, like breath leaving a body. Sundar sat outside on the steps of the courthouse. He didn't feel victory. He didn't feel defeat. He felt nothing at all. Just a long stretch of waiting. An hour passed. Then another. Finally. The doors opened. Everyone rushed in. The judge stood once again. After a review of the presented evidence and testimony, he began. The court finds Minister Raghav Mehta guilty of misuse of power, illegal land acquisition, and obstruction of justice. Gasp filled the room. All assets connected to RM Associates will be frozen. An independent investigation will follow to determine the full extent of the corruption. And then the judge looked at Sundar. This court also acknowledges the role played by Sundar Pichai and Tara Singh in uncovering this corruption. We recommend Tara Singh be posthumously honored by the National Legal Board for her courage and service. And Sundar Pichai, he paused. Asterisk, has shown that the spirit of law can live outside its titles. We invite him to join the Judiciary Training Council, pending formal certification. Not as a symbol, but as a student of justice who reminded us why we entered this profession to begin with. The courtroom exploded in applause, but Sundar just sat still. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He thought of Tara. He thought of her smile, her voice, her stubbornness. And later that evening, when the sun was low and the sky was cold, Sundar stood in a quiet corner of the city by a small wall where someone had painted a mural. It showed a woman holding a scale in one hand and a lantern in the other dot below it were the words, "Truth is the light we owe each other." Sundar placed a small candle beneath the wall. Dot lit, Dot watched the flame flicker, Dot, and finally let himself cry.